Thank you very much. Young, vigorous, talented, intelligent Coro fellows, Coro leadership, and aging water buffaloes of California. Fellow water buffaloes. It is an honor and pleasure to be here, and I will try to wrap this up as rapidly as I can to not punish you any further. One observation, though. Keep your eye on Craig Wilson. People who speak softly, who outline areas and issues in quiet tones, kind of Glenn Peterson approach of how you do things, are deceptively innocent. And I can't think of another speaker I've listened to in recent years who managed to articulate more issues of greater controversy historically in California and do so without being kicked out of the room than our new Delta Water Minister. I concur with him, by the way, that one of his most important functions might be the function of reporting and evaluating. And he highlighted some of the things he's talking about and thinking about. Because often in public policy, the person who can state simply and clearly the issue at hand and the element that you're talking about is better able to start and finish a reasonable debate than all the rest of us, myself included, who get lost in endless details. So, Craig, we are often doing this kind of pairing up operations, but I look forward to working with you a lot in the future. Can I still call you Gracie, even though you're a big, powerful subcommittee chairman in Washington, D.C., in control of massive amounts of money? Anyway, Gracie and I were colleagues in Sacramento and in the legislature, and she's one of the nicest people, in spite of existing in a world of high invectives, loud voices, and overwrought middle-aged male testosterone behavior, otherwise known as the Congress of the United States. And thank you for keeping your good sense, your good judgment, and balance. Gloria's around somewhere or left, I don't know which, but we know she's hiding out there in her outfit. I just appreciate very much working with her. I'm going to walk you through some contextual stuff and then answer some questions. So I hate these, I don't know why, but I'm doing PowerPoint. I hate PowerPoint. Let's go to slide number 1. Some of you have heard this before, you read it in television. My favorite current quote is from John Adams, former president, but when he was defending the British troops during the trial after the Boston Massacre, not a popular position for an American lawyer to be taking in Boston right before the Revolution. He had, as part of his closing argument, a wonderful sentence, but the phrase that has echoed over the years, "Facts are stubborn things," seems to me to be exemplified by a lot of what Coro's all about, and is an example of something we have to remember in public policy. Public policy, at least in the political world, we don't start with facts. We start with waking up in the morning, turning on the television, going to Channel 7, listening to Rick explain some expose, get angry, flying to Sacramento, introducing the bill, defending it to the death, amending it only to get the votes to get out of committee, dealing with the governor who wants to gut the bill and finally agree to do whatever you want to do, and then you announce the bill's passed into law, you fly home, you go to bed, and you forget about it. And you wake up the next morning and turn on Channel 7, you get mad again. Public policy is exactly the reverse from how human beings behave. Public policy is supposed to define the problem, accumulate the evidence, develop the alternatives, a whole bunch of other things, and you decide the damn thing, and then you tell your story. And it's that conflict between politics and public policy development that, in my sense, corrupts the water to play. So, next slide. I'm trying to simplify it. How much water do we have? A lot, but it's not endless. You would be astonished with how many people agree with that but never say it. As a matter of fact, resist saying it. Because if you believe that the supply is not endless, and I know no one who will, under pressure, not admit that, then it suggests that there are choices to be made. Next slide. 97% of all the water that comes into the boundaries of California comes in precipitation. rain and snow. This chart goes back to 1885, the start of the recorded surveying of precipitation in California. Okay? So you've got, what, 120 plus years of recorded history. And the good news is, over that time, the amount of water coming into the state has increased by about 10%. And in fact, the late 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and really until the recent drought, was the wettest 30 years in recorded history in California. But the other thing is, it doesn't rain the same amount every year. Not that that surprises you, but that's a relatively important consideration. Number two. Next slide, please. For those of you in Southern California, you get water from the Colorado River. It was not reflected in the precipitation chart because it comes in through conveyance. In total cumulative amounts, only about 3% of the water that comes into the state is from non-precipitation sources. The Colorado River is far and away the biggest source. But there is a chart from 1905 up to, I think, 2006. And it is the trend line of the flows in the Colorado River, the available supply. And guess what? It's going down. Well, you know, you can make all kinds of arguments about it. There it is. And the trend has been going on, I guess, from, you know, the early parts of last century. That's just a trend. It's just a fact. And in many ways, that doesn't even reflect, by the way, that what was it, 70-year battle of Southern California to keep a larger amount of Colorado River water as the upstates began developing, and, you know, endless lawsuits and political battles and fights in Congress and all that, that finally led with a reduction of the entitlement to its, you know, about 1 million acre feet lost. Anyway, the adjustments that Southern California made in dealing with the Colorado River, albeit after a 70-year battle that was lost, is exactly what's going on with the discussions in the rest of the state. And this is a useful reminder that you cannot have, I don't believe, 100% reliability from nature, no matter how we would prefer it otherwise. Next slide. Okay, who uses how much water in California? I mean, I'm sorry to go back to basic stuff, but if you listen to the political debates in Sacramento and Washington, you'd have no idea what it means. We kind of organize it as follows. All urban water users are lumped together, all individuals, all business, all industry. Agriculture stands alone for its own unique characteristics. We've started counting water that's called environmental water since about the last decade. And that was a big fight that the water exporters won. They wanted the state to start counting that. And, you know, under the usual rubric, be careful what you ask for, you might get it. To the extent you believe that all the water that doesn't go currently to people into agriculture is environmental water, you have conceded that any increased demand for water has to come from the environment. And guess what? You've been losing that legal battle for a long time. By the way, similar unacceptable arguments all over the state from all interested parties. Next slide. This is a great chart from the 2005 State Water Plan Update. Very dense, and we'll make available copies of this on, Coro has a copy, they can post it on their website. We'll have it on the Stewardship Council website as well. But the state started to look at what happens in wet water years, in average water years, and dry years, because, you know, the averages obscure problems that are different. And the reality is, when you take into account precipitation, only about a third of all the rain and snow that comes into the state is usable for any purpose or flows out to the ocean. Only about a third. And, you know, go back to your high school classes and, you know, evaporation, evapotranspiration. So, this chart is the closest thing we have to a figure that explains what the water deal in California is today, and it's worth examining. If you go to the dedication of dedicated water supply, that second block under the green stuff, the first column is a wet year. The rain was 171% of normal. Well, in that year, urban users used about 7.8 million acre feet. That's about 8% of the total. Agriculture uses about 27.3 million acre feet, about, 29% of the total. And environmental water, which is fundamentally everything left, a portion of which is the result of court actions, Delta flow standards, but not all of it. The environment gets almost 60% of the water, or 63%. But because, of course, when it rains a lot, it's all over the state, or most of the time, and people's demand for water tends to be reduced. It just goes to show. The average water year, not that any year is average, but if you average it out, was the year 2000. And on that water year, in an average water year, with a lesser amount of water available. The bottom line is a report of wet water year, 95 million acre feet of water. Human use is urban, agriculture, and environment. So you drop down almost to what, 82 million acre feet, 82.5 million acre feet. There, the urban use percentage increases from 8% in the wet year, goes up to 11% of the available, about 8.9 million acre feet. It stands to reason you want more water when you don't have the rain coming into you. The agricultural water goes up to about 30.2 million acre feet, about 41% of the total. The environmental water drops to 39%, or 48% of the total water. Okay? Now that's the deal. That's average year. Dry year, 2001. Urban uses, about the same, 8.6 million acre feet of water. It's not, it's still roughly the same volume of water being used. But all of a sudden, that's 13% of the total water supply available. Agriculture use is 33.7 million acre feet, 52%. And of course, the bottom line, the environmental water drops to 35% of the total. The deal is very much as people understand it to be. You take water from the environment, you use it in other years. One of the practical problems are, and there are many, is that as Mr. Napolitano and Ms. Gray indicated, gosh, the state's growing, the economy's growing. Even in the midst of the recession, the gross state product of California in 2008 was $1.8 trillion. Gee, gang, that's a lot of money. A lot of money. Next slide. But how do people use water? I apologize for this chart, but as you know, in California, it's immoral to keep statistics on how people use water because it implies they might not be using it wisely or well. And so we don't really pressure people to report a lot. But based on the best evidence from the Department of Water Resources, this is at least one chart we're struggling with. It goes back to 1950. Hard to read, but let me show you. The agricultural water use is, of course, the largest single period. This is before the environmental stuff started to be counted back in 1950. And up at the top of the first line on the left is a dark blue box. That's urban use. The rest is agricultural. As you jump forward, you see that the total volume of water being used increases. That's because we started to build and completed building the federal water project and the state water project. All of a sudden, meaning you could start exporting from the Delta water that you were not previously able to get anywhere else. So the water volume being used for all purposes go up. Go to the far right, all those years are grouped together, and you start to see bigger blue lines of dark blue. That's because there is a growth in absolute water use by urban areas over time. It still is dwarfed by agriculture, but the growth is significant, and I suppose if you project out 100, 150 years, the growth rate, urban use will exceed even agriculture. God knows where it come from, but I guess it has to come from the environment. But the point I want to make to you is, to the best extent we can determine, and I think you should be skeptical of all these figures, the per capita water use by human beings, which is all urban water allocated by the number of people in the area being counted, hasn't changed very much. Met's managed in the last, 12, 15 years to handle a million extra people coming down without, they say, any increase in water. They've been doing that by various efficiencies and conservations. There are a couple studies around that suggest the most effective conservation techniques grew out of the decline of the defense industry, heavily water dependent, and the substitution of other business and industrial activities, less water dependent. And there are other studies that suggest the commercial and industrial efficiencies that have been mandated by law, usually for water quality, have had a beneficial impact on water use. The evidence on individual use is less certain, although there are signs of it improving. Anyway, the point to make is if the supply is fixed, although it's gone up 10% in 120 years, if it's fixed and the use is not declining, it should not surprise anyone that there are tensions coming around, which leads to the next slide. If you had to pick an approach to provide a reliable supply of water for, pick Los Angeles, going 400 miles through Northern California into the most sensitive ecosystem in the state, in the largest estuary in the western hemisphere of the world, full of contentious and angry Northerners who go to their muskets sitting in the closets anytime any of you show up. If you had to choose a source for water, a source where the ecosystem's declining, and the Richard Nixon Endangered Species Act, he signed it by the way, and the Clean Water Act that he signed, are all imposing new conditions, restrictions, and limits. If you had to pick a place to get water, God, that probably wouldn't be the first place you look. Okay, next slide. This is a chart, Craig and I had talked about this before, but Delta Vision did this. This was so deeply controversial, I commend it to you highly. It took us 6 months of pitched battle with all the interest groups, including all the Met experts on statistics, to try to develop a map that in a very graphic way tries to explain to everyone north and south where the water comes from and where it goes. And this gets to something Craig said that he didn't highlight. I'm going to abuse what you said and kind of stretch it beyond where you'd like it to go. But in the state of California, all of us are responsible for helping to create the problems that occur today in the Delta. And it's not just an exporter's problem, all of us. So if you look up there, that big gray beige block is the Delta watershed. It is almost all of the Sierra Nevada mountain range that historically has flowed down the mountains into the San Joaquin River that flows north, or the Sacramento River that flows south through the Delta into San Francisco Bay, out into the ocean. It doesn't even include the Tulare Basin, the southern San Joaquin Valley, and that's because the Department of Water Resources, for a variety of reasons, doesn't count it. But what it points out is, gee, there's, much of the water supply of California historically has flown through what is now the water supply, historically flowed through the Delta, went out the bay into the ocean. And of course, the use of the water is important. That chart shows, and all of my neighbors and friends in Sacramento don't like it now, that's not true. Some of them do because they understand this. The total volume of water being used and probably not returned to the rivers and streams by all of us in the Delta watershed, water that historically used to flow through the Delta, is probably close to equal to the amount that is exported to valley agriculture and a sliver of it coming down south. That, and Craig alluded to this Delta watershed use. I know you think it's just simple, it might be just simple reason. Where I come from, it's treason. You can't talk this way because all of us have spent our lives understanding that the Delta's problems can only be attributed to exports and nothing else, which is not the same thing to say that exports have no damage. They clearly do. That's why we have a lot of operational problems today. A couple of other things that always surprise Northerners is the volume of water. By the way, the shape of that blue line running down is an attempt to illustrate the volume of water that is sent to various places. So this is an average figure. Across the Tehachapi's come roughly 1.5 million acre feet of water a year, not giant. That's why smart water people down south, they always, if they have 3 drinks in a bar, they'll tell you, Jesus, what would it take to get us off the State Water Project, that terribly complicated, highly litigious, regionally antagonistic system we're now tied to. And that's why the illustration you just heard from the replenishment district, the discussion that Rob went through, is so fundamentally important. The notion of self-reliance self-reliance is not just a phrase that appeals to Americans' romantic belief in the self-made man, concept largely ignored as best I can tell. It is a clear, articulated strategy by an important district as to how they would prefer to provide their services to the people of their region in the most reliable, cost-effective way. And that is a short-term response to meet an understandable future goal. And most of the water planning in California is short-term response to meet the only goal that people talk about is maintenance of the status quo, which everyone knows cannot continue. Next slide, please. This is all fun. I love this stuff. If you think the delta is not affected by any of this, upstream diversions, exports, wrong. What's happened, this is the average year, wet year, dry year. And over on the left are the outflows. Last night I was late in a bar, Pierre Swan and I were arguing with each other, as we've done periodically over the last decade about some of this stuff. And I accused him, and I said, God damn, Pierre, water that goes to the ocean is not wasted. You need water to maintain an ecosystem with a habitat and to deal with species. And the notion that that it's not important to the ecosystem is dead wrong. And of course, you don't go with the outflows have been reduced. And Pierre says, I didn't say that. I don't mean that. You're a jerk. And that's in fact one of the most delightful discussions I've had in my life with anybody for over 10 years. Not just that discussion, but the ongoing discussion, because there are legitimate disputes that have to be aired. But to Pierre's credit, he's willing to honor to have those debates up front, and most people are not. So anyway, this shows some damage. One other slide. Next slide, please. This is a surrogate slide. This is the salmon decline in the Delta ecosystem. It's attributable to a lot of things. And the current game in statewide water politics is to find a possible impact on salmon or delta smelt or something that might be somebody else's fault, to urge correct that problem first before you talk about something that might affect me, and go from there. And we're actually proceeding to develop a list of what are called stressors, the current terminology for what impacts the delta. And I think that stressor list will surprise a lot of people, because the first stressor, and the most obvious, is the conversion of 740,000 acres of periodically flooded wetlands to agriculture and urban. I mean, that's the first, and then the channelization of the water system, both for flood control and for export purposes, are probably the two biggest drivers of the impact. There are many, many others as well. Next slide, please. A couple special problems, and as you plan this, I just want to raise it. These next slides are only to illustrate the problem. Each subject would take a day on its own. So groundwater and climate change are nexus issues. I mean, they're just complicated. Next slide. The groundwater tables in the San Joaquin Valley, a good part of the Northern California and San Joaquin Basin, which are the repositories of the largest total volume of groundwater storage, and are fundamentally important for the future of the state, are unregulated. And so we have estimates, but I won't bore you. Those are the 5 areas. The ones that are farthest up north, the top colored lines, they get a lot of water and they use a lot of water, but it, generally stays the same. But when you get down to the bottom two, you're talking about trend lines for 1962 through 2003, largely in the aquifers near the Tulare Basin. And I get yelled at every time I use the word overdraft because people say it's not critical. So let me just put it in a different way. The use of underground water supplies in excess of any human capacity to replace those supplies. It's what's called using your bank account for ongoing purposes of paying your house mortgage when you know you can only afford 10 more payments because your money runs out. Using one-time money for long-term purposes doesn't make much sense. That is a deeply troubling problem, not just for the farmers down there, largely farmers, not exclusively, not just for them, for statewide. Next slide, please. The cheapest storage facilities for water in California are the Sierra Nevada mountains or any range of mountains high enough to have snow. If you had a choice, you'd store all your water on the mountaintops, and then we'd pass a resolution. Met would pass a resolution that says, Met would pass a resolution, they'd say, it's July 15th, 2010, mountains melt about 100,000 acre-feet of water. But of course, it doesn't work that way. This slide shows on the left the current status of the snowpack. But the problems are that all the projections are with climate change, global warming, that the snowpack will decrease. Because, of course, the warmer the temperature, the water stays in the state, but it turns into rain. In the last 100 years, the peak date for Sierra Nevada flows has moved about a month forward. All the storage facilities we've got in the state today, the big ones anyway, and the older ones, that's most of them, were based upon climatologic assumptions of 1930, 1940, 1950, patterns that everyone said existed as long as they knew. Guess what? They're changing. It is deeply troubling for smart water managers to speculate that, which is another reason why you wouldn't go 400 miles to get a water supply system that is more subject to variation on an increasing basis from these two conditions if you had your choices. So, let's see, next, and I think it's not the last slide. Yeah, this is just a summary of everything Craig said, which is what's going on. Let me give you a couple of observations, and this is modern politics. If you haven't seen the Wall Street Journal article this morning, take a look at it. The headline was essentially Bay Delta Conservation Plan delayed. That's not quite the right title, but it's close to it. No surprise. But it did have some quotes from Lester Snow and others essentially saying, no, we won't reach our deadline of November for release of the draft plan. It was previously to be released in August. It got continued. Oh, look, the issues remaining in that process are deeply contentious and enormously controversial. And my experience with all interest groups, even all of you who supported the water package of bills last year, is that whenever there's an anticipated change in political power, new governor in California, maybe our new friends in Washington will do what we want them to do, everyone goes into hibernation for about 6 months to see what the lay of the land is in Washington or with the new governor. That's one thing you got to keep in mind. It does not mean the end of the BDC process, in my opinion. It is a process that needs to be completed. You've got to have the information base. We can't simply be going through yelling at each other without an expanded scientific array of information at hand. Number two, the budget problems nationally and in California will continue for many years to come. The willingness of the voters to tax themselves will continue to be low for many years to come. If you think there's anything different, God knows I hope you're right, but I don't believe it. This is a belief, by the way, I'm not peddling it as a fact. But I think you can start to see the signs on the wall. Reliance on general obligation bonds in the state of California, those backed by a vote of the people and backed by the full faith and credit of the state of California, will decline. Doesn't mean we won't have a vote on the GO bonds in 2012. We will. But whether it's transportation, which has increasingly used GO bonds because nobody wants to raise the gas tax, or whether it's water-related bonds where we have come to depend on GO bonds on a state level, locally you do a lot more revenue bonds and other things. That trend is coming to an end. The financing of the projects are no longer going to be what they were in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, early 90s. Regional self-sufficiency is state policy, and there are a lot of smarties, including a lot of smarties in this room, who are doing it. It's likely to become even more important. It is, however, a matter that is discussed publicly only in the worst of all terms. Give me money to do good. That is not the right way to peddle this. I was frankly compelled. Discussion yesterday with WOW and in the water replenishment district argument. Districts which honestly say they have a plan that gets them to their own reliance are essentially saying we can help you out to solve a statewide problem. That is so rare and so important. So rare and so important that you ought to mark what was said here today as perhaps the start of a really fundamental change and shift in discussing water issues. Conservation is a really big deal. And conservation does not mean, yeah, I'm going to conserve all the water and I get to keep it and I get to use it, except when I want to sell it to Met for $17,000 per acre foot or whatever the figure is. We all, throughout all of California, north and south, have a fundamental duty to be prudent in our use of water. By the way, Craig's comment about the Constitution, Article 10. The Constitution is the supreme law of the state of California. Water rights are subject to the provisions of the Constitution. Groundwater is subject to the provisions of the Constitution. Surface water is subject to the provisions of the Constitution. Yes, the Constitution says there's a favor for beneficial uses of water, but it says the uses have to be reasonable and may not be wasted. I predict you will see endless disputes and litigations over reasonable and wasting in the years to come, unless we more intelligently and publicly address some of these policy issues. Last point, the Delta Plan by the Delta Stewardship Council will be adopted no later than January 1st, 2012, as required by statute. The Wall Street Journal article today suggests that we will not have the full array of their information available to us in time for consideration by the plan, which I think is too bad, but the law said, do it. It is a legally enforceable state regulation. It is designed to guide state agencies and local entities, in this case, most obviously, the Delta counties, who bristle with the thought that a group of officious intermeddlers like me and Grace will have something to say on this issue, but that's what, that's the law. And it gives us an opportunity to further rational discussion. So final word, and hold me to this, this will be the last time I'll say nice things about Matt for a while, because it's so much fun to say bad things about you. I spent so many years doing it, and I feel like a criminal. You've got a lot of things to be proud about, and although this is contentious internally, I think there's one thing you ought to insist the rest of the state do. When you went through that contentious drought allocation projection for the future, the notion, if the water supply drops to here, here's where the cuts come. I mean, I didn't participate in the discussions, but I heard enough secondhand to know that that was one of the more wrenching things you had to do. Deeply contentious, deeply disappointing. You're probably still in litigation from some of the member agencies. That was one of the most grown-up, intelligent, and meaningful policy decisions that I've seen a water agency use. I don't know whether the terms were correct. I haven't gotten into those details. But the notion that an entity, a government entity, would stand up and say, gosh, the supplies may be reduced for a host of reasons. Don't we have to plan for that? Rather than, you can't say that. They'll use that as an excuse not to send us any water. The traditional response, it's real grown up. It's real impressive. And you ought to be damn proud of what you did. So.